Thank you for downloading this podcast from the Forum for Philosophy. Subscribe for weekly discussions of science, culture, politics, and the arts from a philosophical perspective. The Forum is a non-profit organisation, and our events are free and open to all. You can support our work via our website and Facebook page.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the LSE, and welcome to this forum event on the life and work of E B Du Bois. So E B Du Bois, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, very well known as a civil rights campaigner, sociologist, author of books including Souls of Black Folk, Black Reconstruction, but arguably a rather neglected figure in the history of philosophy, because his contributions to philosophy were significant too. And in this panel event, we're going to be discussing what Du Bois can teach philosophy today on topics as wide-ranging as his views on race, racism, politics, and his views on the nature of science. And it's a real pleasure to be joined by three panelists coming to this topic from very different backgrounds, bringing different expertise to bear. I mean, they are Liam Kofi Bright, philosopher from here at the LSE, Brian Kelly, historian from Queen's University, Belfast, and Meera Sabaratnam from the School of Oriental and African Studies, expert in international relations. To give you a sense of the format for the event, we'll be talking a bit among the panel about various key issues relating to Du Bois, and then a couple of points throughout the event. We'll take questions from you, the audience, give you the chance to put your questions to the panel. I mean, let's start with you, Brian. I mean, just some of the basics about Du Bois, about his life, about his work. When did he live? What sort of environment was he living in?
Okay, so Du Bois lives a very long public life. He's born in 1868, which is 3 years after the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery in the United States, and probably a year in which the hopes of former slaves were higher than they'd ever been. Great optimism about the possibilities for the future. And then he comes of age, really. He reaches maturity at a period when all those hopes have been dashed, right? By the mid-1880s and into the 1890s, when Du Bois goes to university, white supremacy is back in the saddle in the South. Whites have set about the resubjugation of black workers across the South, former slaves. And in place of that great optimism, a sense of deep despair is set in the black community. Du Bois is part of a conversation about how to move forward in these very difficult circumstances. But he lives until, so he writes Black Reconstruction, the book that I write, and probably the most important book in American historiography. The book I study, sorry, I wish I wrote it. He writes that in 1935, when he's 67 years old, and he lives almost 30 years after that. So, and all that time, really from the 1890s all the way up until his death in 1963, he dies on the morning that King gives his I Have a Dream speech, the March on Washington. All through that time, Du Bois is in the public limelight. He is the towering black intellectual of his lifetime. He's a public figure, an activist, but operating, because he's active over 60 or 70 years, in some very different contexts. And that makes it hard to kind of pick out, when we ask, was Du Bois a Pan-Africanist? Well, at certain points in his career he was. Was he a Marxist or socialist? At certain points in his career he arguably came close to that. But he moves through a long lifetime of very of shifting context.
Yeah, like many significant philosophers, right? Views not stable throughout his lifetime, but constantly changing. I mean, what sort of context did he have a receptive audience in America at that time?
I would say the height of his influence is really around a few periods, really, but I would say around the turn of the century, between the late 1890s and the First World War. Du Bois is a major figure in black politics. He's one of the founders of the Niagara movement during that period, and then the NAACP. He is the editor of the NAACP's newspaper, The Crisis, and tremendously influential. He's involved in the key debate of that period over strategy for black politics, and he sets himself off as an opponent of Booker T. Washington. We can maybe get into that later on, but this comes to be known as the Washington-Du Bois debate, a debate over how African Americans in the South can move themselves forward in tough times. I will say one important thing about Du Bois that we need to bear in mind. When he's born in 1868 and really all the way up until about 1910, the vast majority of African Americans live in the slave states and former slave states of the South. 90+% of all African Americans live in the South up until the period of the First World War. Du Bois is not part of that world. He's born in what is still remote rural western Massachusetts. He's the only black student in his graduating class. And he comes up in a very different environment than what black Southerners would have been accustomed to.
So his formative environment was one pretty dominated by white people.
Absolutely. And also one which gave him more space to develop his intellectual powers than he would have been allowed in the South. So he attends Fisk University on a scholarship. It's the first time he actually goes south to Nashville, and I think it's 1886. He gets a position eventually at Atlanta University in the South. He's the first African American to be awarded a PhD from Harvard University. And so he's in some ways in a world of his own for much of his early life, and only begins to come into contact with his people. I mean, when he goes to Fisk in 1886, he says, "From this point forward, I was a Negro." He saw himself then as part of the Black South, or Black America, most of which resided in the South.
He saw that as a kind of epiphany, a kind of key moment in his life.
Yeah, there are a few of these.
And he sounds like someone with, 1 foot in the academic world, 1 foot outside of it. Is that
Well,
true?
he's got 2 feet. He's a very serious academic. I mean, I think he would have seen himself primarily as an intellectual. And he also grew up at a time when he was influenced, I think, by the wider currents that were kind of in the air at the time. And there was a sense among white intellectuals who Du Bois would have rubbed shoulders with at Harvard, that they had a leading role to play in reforming away the excesses of an industrial capitalist society. Du Bois is part of that. And this is where he constructs this idea of a talented tenth, a black elite, an aristocracy among the race who would lead the black masses out of their condition.
Controversial idea, I take it.
Extremely controversial, and I think worth exploring maybe at length here.
I mean, let's bring Liam in on this, shall we? I mean, on any of these aspects of Du Bois' life, but perhaps also his books in particular, The Souls of Black Folk, for example, crucially important book.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about Du Bois' development is thinking about how he moved politically over his life, where certainly at the beginning of his life he has these kind of philanthropic elitist ideals of being part of a sort of intellect of the mind who are going to lead the masses forward by displaying their high ideals and putting forward ideas which would naturally gain the allegiance of the masses if presented in the right kind of way. And there's an extent to which he moved away from that as he was older. He became more and more democratic. He became more and more thought that we should take our cue from the sort of the democratic will of the great mass of people, and so not this kind of elite guiding vision. And yet his last public statement on this, he said that he thought his mistake when he talked about a talented tenth when he was younger was that was too big a group. It should be the guiding 100th. So the movement went both ways, shall we say. So he's someone who kind of has this very interesting... there are a number of tensions in his view which aren't just present chronologically, but also kind of are always there, where there's always this feature of Du Bois that he wants to empower people and yet at the same time believes there's a kind of natural leadership class, which he, of course, counts himself amongst.
That's this sort of elitist aspect to his thought. You think running all the way through his career comes and goes.
So, I mean, there's interesting... So maybe it's worth saying a little bit about what the two aspects of his thought were. So, on the one hand, there's the idea which could be underlying this idea of the talented tenth, which is that a large number of people are sort of living their lives wrong and taking part in immoral actions or actions which are bound to be not successful on their own terms because they sort of don't understand themselves in the world they live in. And what's needed is for clear-sighted people to make apparent how the world actually is and so allow us to take more successful action and more moral action. And he never drops that. He always has the belief that there's a lot of sort of fundamental error, misunderstanding, propaganda. In this book, Black Reconstruction, the last chapter is called The Propaganda of History, and it's about how historians, he thought, especially white historians, were really misleading African Americans as to their own society and what their own recent past. So he retains that kind of, there's a lot of error in the world and only an elite few can help us see through it. But at the same time, he comes more and more to think that, to appreciate rather, the extent to which democracy will give us good decisions, that somehow the sort of the pooled wisdom of many, many people will outdo the thinking of just one person, it's kind of with the wisdom of crowds. And so his whole life, I think, is trying to balance these...
Balancing the elitism and the democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Brian, you mentioned he had various epiphanies throughout his life. I mean, what were the others?
Well, I mean, I think a very big one, and I was reminded when Liam was talking just at the end here about his attachment or his aspiration to democracy. The problem for Du Bois really around the turn of the century is he was, as much as he may have committed himself to democracy, there was very little of it on offer for African Americans in the United States, and particularly in the South, where from the mid-1890s onward, black people are deprived of the vote. By 1905 and 1906, every southern state has passed laws which deprive the vast majority of African American men, of course, women didn't have the vote at the time, of the right to vote. And one of the big epiphanies in Du Bois, and I think this kind of sums up his relationship to democracy in some ways, is Du Bois is somebody who believes that you can marshal kind of empirical facts, you can marshal evidence through the social sciences and so forth, deliver this data to a reasonable elite, white elite in this case, and you can convince them to act otherwise, to reverse their decisions. And he talks about it himself in his autobiography. In 1906, he's on his way to, there's an atmosphere of hysteria being whipped up in Atlanta, Georgia, which was really the glistening metropolis of the, New South creed in the South. So Du Bois is on his way to the newspaper offices, the Atlanta Constitution, with a set of notes in his pocket to try to convince the editor that he should tone down the hysteria that's being whipped up. When he, en route, he discovers that a young African-American farm laborer by the name of Sam Hose has been lynched. And Du Bois reports that actually parts of his body, it was common in late 19th century lynchings in the South to dismember and mutilate the victims, vast majority of whom were poor African-American men, that parts of Sam Hose's body are on sale on his route from Morehouse College, where he's ensconced, to the newspaper office. He puts his notes back in his pocket, turns around, and I think it's a shattering experience for him in terms of curing for him the delusion that pure reason, that just by reasoning with white elites, the situation could be changed.
That sort of social science by itself would somehow solve all of these problems. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also a notable change in his writing style around this point, where he goes from writing sort of quite dry, relatively dry academic treatises that's relative to his later writing, to writing much more evocative prose, where I think part of what's happened is he thinks that we can't just present the facts to refute the racist ideas which are being spread. They need to be presented in such a way that will sort of grab people's attention and shift their emotional relationship to the world and the other people in their society.
And writing for a wider audience, perhaps, at that point.
Yes, certainly. Although, I mean, it should be said, even when he was doing more pure social sciences, one might say, he was also well known as an innovator in data or visual representation of data. And so you can see they're available online, Du Bois's contributions to the Paris exhibition in 1900. And they're really beautiful. I mean, they stand out as sort of, they hold their own as pieces of modernist art as well as pieces of science. And so, you know, it's not that it wasn't there before that he was thinking about how to present the information in a way that was evocative, but I think this is a moment where he really sort of shifts gear and it becomes more of a focus for him.
Yeah, and I think just in terms of talking about Du Bois's context and trajectory, just to put that in a global context, he is born essentially before the scramble for Africa, and he dies after most African countries have been decolonized formally. And the links between his own thinking and the emergence and sort of high noon of the decolonization movement also needs to be borne in mind, because what Du Bois is struggling with, we can also consider as a specific instantiation of a global problem. So to some extent, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam is struggling with a similar problem of how to deal with the relations between elites and masses, what the nature of transnational identification is. Whether, let's say, race, and we'll come on to this, is a question of birth or biology or something much more kind of sociological and historical. So we should always consider that Du Bois has many contemporaries struggling with similar kinds of issues.
I mean, I think Du Bois has the very famous line that the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the colour line, where he thinks that what imperialism is doing is making this kind of Western problem of the relationship between the so-called superior races and the inferior races, well, it's now global because the whites have taken over everywhere and imposing their supposed superiority on everyone else. And so,
So, I mean, it's natural to ask with any figure in the history of philosophy whether their thought was something that was a product of their particular circumstances and time, or whether it's something that has a certain kind of timelessness to it. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying, you know, Du Bois is an example of someone who, what he was writing was very much addressing the urgent questions of his time, as opposed to perhaps trying to go off into the abstract realm of philosophical questions that kind of float free of any particular historical context.
I'd say that's broadly right, but along the way to, I mean, this, and I think this often happens with many philosophers, along the way to answering those particular questions of the problems of his day, he found that, for instance, he had to clarify matters regarding the scientific method. So one of the problems he ran into was that he thought that social scientists were just saying false things en masse about African Americans. And so he was trying to think, like, why is that? Why are they getting things so wrong so systematically, despite the fact that they purport to be scientists? And he had a lot to say, and I think we're going to get onto it later. But in doing that, he had to sort of answer questions about what is good inquiry, how can we find out about the world in a reliable way. And so I think he shares with many of the great philosophers this sense in which answering the particular questions of his day requires him, in the name of intellectual honesty, to also answer these very general abstract questions, classic questions of philosophy. So there's sort of a dialogue between the abstract and the particular in him.
Right, I mean, let's talk about Du Bois's views about race in particular, race and racism. I mean, Meera, do you want to explain some of those key ideas?
Yes, I suppose what's interesting about Du Bois is that, as with other things, his views change over the course of his very long intellectual life. But there's maybe two interesting elements that we can pull out. So the element that I think most contemporary people would feel most comfortable about in Du Bois's writings about race is that he is what I would call a materialist about race. That is, he sees race as the production of specific social relations that have a history that change over time and that are linked to the political and economic structures that they're embedded in. And I think that's a set of insights which was relatively relatively groundbreaking at the time and is one with which I would say the main kind of intellectual consensus is now. However, being a man of his time, essentially born in the Victorian era, you can also find a strand in his thinking which is what you might call organicist about race. So he thinks that races are real things, right? So in the course of his writings, he identifies a different number of races depending on where you look. But he makes claims such as, there are 7 or 8 races. They are the Mongolian, the Hindustani, the Slavic, the Teutonic, et cetera, and believes that these races are a primary grouping in human existence and have a specific contribution to make to human civilization. Now, there are various ways in which he reconciles over the course of his life, or attempts to reconcile on the one hand, the sort of need to see race as a product of social and political relations, and on the other hand, the reality, the lived reality or the experience of race and the phenomenon of group consciousness and group collective striving.
Yeah, Liam, let's bring you in on this. Philosophers today debate this issue of whether race is socially constructed or whether it's a natural category. Where is Du Bois in relation to this?
So Du Bois is usually thought of as the founder of 2 of the main schools in the philosophy of race, reflecting the fact that he changed his mind over time, and it turns out his thought was so productive that 2 of the main views now take their cue from him. The first of those, as was just mentioned, is the view that, in some sense, what makes a race, certain kinds of social relationships amongst its members. So something about sharing a culture, sharing certain patterns of life. And so when he'll give these different races, he'll say, well, the Teutons, they're the people who write prose this kind of way, or something like that. Now, certainly what people nowadays do not take from Du Bois is his specific cultural claims about what the Teutons are doing, whatever. But the idea that somehow what makes a race is some kind of shared cultural commonality, that has remained current. But later on in his thinking, another one of Du Bois's many famous quotable lines is challenged to define what it is to be black. He says, well, I can define what it is to be black with full legal force. To be black is to have to ride the Jim Crow cart in Alabama. And there we see this development of this idea that races are things which are hierarchically ordered in a kind of social political sense. And so race is a tool for social domination, a means by which you group some people as higher than others in an implicit or an explicit social hierarchy. And these are 2 different ideas but related. They both have this feature that a race is somehow created by the ways we interact with each other socially. But in one of them, races are kind of definitionally hierarchical. Race is just the kind of thing which is the basis of some kind of social hierarchy. Whereas in the other, it's at least possible to imagine an egalitarian relationship between races, even if we don't happen to instantiate that now.
Meera?
So I'd maybe just add a twist to that, which is I think he writes about blackness and whiteness quite differently. So actually when he's writing about whiteness rather than blackness, he's much more, I would say, of a materialist and a skeptic about the value or the reality of group identification. This is particularly around the time of the First World War and immediately afterwards, when essentially Europe has torn itself apart in an enormous bloodbath, and all of the claims about the civilization and the forbearance of Europe are being doubted. And he writes about the invention of whiteness. He said, when did people decide they were white? And he recalls the invention of whiteness as actually being a very recent phenomenon, as indeed it was.
When did he place it to?
So he places it, essentially to the late 19th century. It's the discovery of whiteness amongst the descendants of these European groupings. This is a recent thing. And he says, what's special about it? So what's interesting is that he deconstructs all of the mythologies of whiteness within his writings and says, look, they haven't got a special claim to be better or smarter than anybody else. They haven't got a special claim to be more advanced scientifically. What makes the difference between whites and others is the width of the stage on which they've played their part, right? So they just happened to become to power, essentially in an age of globalization, industrialization, imperial expansion. And he makes very clear that he sees no special moral characteristic that makes white people inherently worse or inherently better than any other race, but that it's this global stage on which they're playing their part in the late 19th and early 20th century that means that the crimes are, let's say, multiplied accordingly. And I think that's an interesting kind of...
Yeah, so to come in on that, I mean, it's interesting that when Du Bois does list the races, what we would nowadays think of as white people is actually, for him, multiple races. And so I think part of, I mean, this is implicit in what you said, but part of what makes whiteness a somewhat suspect category to Du Bois is it's not a real race to him. It's just an amalgamation of different groups which have clubbed up to form, in the Scramble for Africa, for instance, have made a load of deals to conquer the world together, but that doesn't make them somehow a real cultural grouping.
The only thing I would add to that is that I think it's probably implicit already in what people have said, but that Du Bois didn't set this idea of race into circulation. He was operating in a milieu where those ideas were deeply embedded in the way that particularly elites, white elites, looked out at the world around them. And so Du Bois is attempting to kind of navigate and strategize in a context in which he hasn't constructed himself. And it's in that context, I think, where he begins to think about race. My general view is that Du Bois aimed toward a kind of a universalist idea that there was a human race, but that in terms of black politics, also held to the idea that an element of race pride, black nationalism, Pan-Africanism could be a kind of offer some shield against the denigration, the constant denigration from white society. So I think for him, in some ways, race pride and the need to kind of encourage that was an attempt to build up a black nation which could claim its own in a universal society.
I mean, Liam, that quotation about Jim Crow, suggests a very, very close relationship between race and racism. It almost suggests if there was no racism, there would be no races. Is that his view, or is it more subtle than that?
I mean, I think it's just that you can find different views in him at different times. So certainly at one point in his career, this is, I think, from the text Darkwater, you can find... it's Dusk of Dawn, where you can find Du Bois saying things which do seem to suggest that if we ended racial oppression, in some sense, we would just have got rid of races, and that would be the sense in which he's some kind of universalist. It would be a good thing to move to a world in which people do not have races. But that's not the only view you can find in Du Bois. You can certainly also find Du Bois saying things which seem to suggest that in the ideal future, it's not that there won't be separate races, it's just that we'll be seen as equals and everyone will be allowed to sort of make their contribution to world culture and be appreciated as equals making such contributions. So,
Meera, I mean, one of his key ideas here was this concept of double consciousness. Do you want to say something about what that meant?
Yes, I mean, I suppose there's actually a debate over whether double consciousness is a key idea for Du Bois. He uses it a few times in The Souls of Black Folk. It's not really developed, but it has been widely picked up by scholars after him, which makes it interesting. In The Souls of Black Folk, he describes double consciousness actually in a couple of ways. So in the first way, it's the sense of other people looking at you and defining you. So this peculiar sensation of being sort of gazed upon by others. But he uses it a couple of sentences later in a different way, which is of two souls warring in the same body, right? An African soul and an American soul, struggling to keep the parts together. Now, this has been picked up because it's prefigurative in two interesting ways, but almost in opposite ways. So the first thing where you're saying this double consciousness is produced by other people looking at me funny, basically. You can read through, let's say, a sort of materialist theory of alienation, right? There are dominant forces in the world that define what blackness means. It's very negative. I, as a subject with my own kind of psychology, experience their negativity, but I also resist it. So you can read it as a sort of psychologically productive tension. The other reading, though, so that sees blackness as basically rooted in, let's say, alienation. The other reading is a more optimistic one, and it says there is this Negro spirit which I have, and there is that's a term used by Du Bois, and there's an American spirit that I have, and I know that both have worth in them, and I don't want to have to choose between them, and I want to deliver both unto the world, right? So there's a story of redemption in that second reading of double consciousness, which, again, kind of feeds into what Liam was saying about people taking Du Bois's, even that one paragraph, in very different directions.
I mean, relatedly, there's this interesting passage in a dialogue he wrote, which is a conversation between a sort of an imagined white interlocutor and himself, where he has the white interlocutor describe what he thinks it means to be a good American of his day. And the white America goes through and describes, well, on the one hand, I have these ideals of being a good American, sort of a thrifty capitalist, basically. On the other hand, I have these ideals of being a good Christian, which is a sort of charitable philanthropist in many ways. And then I have this idea of being a good white man, which is a sort of domineering lord of the other races. And gosh darn it, it seems very hard to simultaneously be a thrifty philanthropist overlord. And so there's a sense in which there are multiple points in Du Bois's writing where he does analyze this idea that the same person can find himself torn between different ideals. And double consciousness is the phrase which has been picked up on a lot, because there's the experience of African Americans in particular he's talking about, but it seems to be part of a theme he was interested in other areas.
And and it's also interesting that double consciousness also has roots in both, let's say, the romantic movement of the sort of 19th century, where people were starting to think about the spirits that were, in men and struggling with reason, essentially, that struggle. And also in the development of the novel as a literary form, in which the first kind of real attempts to present consciousness as kind of coherent, and also to play with the fractures that could come about in consciousness through the novel form. So Du Bois, would read lots of these Dickensian romantic and George Eliot and those kinds of romantic writers, and think about the production of the South.
Can we talk about the debates Du Bois was embroiled in his own lifetime about race, and this debate Liam alluded to with Booker T. Washington? Brian, do you want to tell us what the controversy was there?
The context for the debate is that, as I say, whites have returned to power in the South from about 1877, 1880 onward, and from the mid-'80s have embarked on a campaign aimed at basically putting blacks back in their place in the South. And this is also in a context of rapid industrialization. The South that its elites want to build is an industrial South with the same kind of, that can compete with Pittsburgh and Chicago and other places. And black labor is to be the foundation of that new South. Blacks have lost the right to vote. They are reminded at every turn, really, of their inferior status. They go to separate and unequal schools. The Supreme Court in 1896, U.S. Supreme Court, sanctioned segregation as the law of the land. And Rayford Logan, early African-American historian, calls this the nadir in African-American history, the low point in African-American history. Leon Litwack has called it the most brutal and repressive period in the history of U.S. race relations. So somewhere between 1880 and 1915, when the First World War breaks things open a bit, very difficult period for African Americans in the South. Booker T. Washington is a former slave born in the South who, in 1895, is invited to make a speech at the Atlanta Exposition. It's kind of an agricultural fair where he's invited by prominent whites. and gives a speech and basically says, we will surrender the demand for political and civic equality in return for a little bit of peace. Basically, Washington accepts segregation. And toward blacks in the South, he says, we must forget about politics, save our money, be thrifty, sober, and 20, 30, 40 years from now, we may be able to return to full equality. For Du Bois, this is he's repulsed by this. And Du Bois argues that it is wrong to surrender any of the kind of political rights that African Americans had won. And so there's a debate that takes place between them. You can read the text of that. There's a chapter in Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, which is published in 1903, and it's a chapter called Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others. And really, that's the best place to get Du Bois's side of the story. I would argue that both, ironically, neither of the strategies, either the one pursued by Washington, which is about surrendering political equality and concentrating on industrial education, learning how to build a house and so forth, nor Du Bois's, which relied on this talented tenth, an elite that would deliver the race, neither of them really speaks to the needs of the overwhelming majority of African Americans in the South, who are destitute, exploited, oppressed, imprisoned, all the rest of it. Both of them are, Du Bois is in many ways something I'd be more sympathetic to. He advocates protest. We must protest our conditions. But he doesn't really have a solution to the problem of the predicament that most African Americans live in.
One of Du Bois's most fascinating arguments in this period is, so Du Bois was a trained sociologist, and he also had a kind of all but the defense PhD in economic history from Berlin. There's a strange bureaucratic story about how he didn't end up having the actual PhD. He was eventually awarded the PhD by Khrushchev later in his life, who just directed the East German University to do that. So, thanks, Khrushchev. But
he paid a heavy price for that.
Yeah, no, he did. But sort of Du Bois had done a number of studies, and one of the things he brings out in this argument with Booker T. Washington is the thought that so Booker T. Washington can be seen as advocating, let's negotiate from a position of strength. Right now, it really was a period of just terrible, terrible oppression for African Americans in the South, and they're not really in a position to defend themselves. So Booker T. Washington said we can't fight this now. We'll build up money, we'll build up wealth, and when you have money, Americans have to respect you. So we will negotiate later from a position of strength, from the one kind of thing Americans do respect, which is money. But one of the things that persuaded Du Bois was the thought, well, there are a number of arguments, but I think one of the most interesting is that based on his own study of people who had been building up wealth in the South, who were African Americans who were running successful farms, successful businesses, is they were attacked and the sheriff wouldn't protect them, or the state would refuse to fund the roads to and from their farm, and so they weren't able to actually sell their produce. And so Du Bois argued, and this was partly based on the work of Ida B. Wells, another famous sociologist and journalist and activist who he had some interactions with throughout his life. But part of Du Bois's argument, therefore, was that it just can't work. The Booker T. Washington's strategy, this attempt to sort of retreat and just build up our power base, it can't work because of the kind of thing, the way politics and economics interact, the way they're not fully separate spheres, but they're deeply intertwined. So.
Thanks. It'd be great at this point to take a few questions from the audience on these issues relating to Du Bois's life and work and his views on race and racism. I could take a block of maybe 3 questions. Let's go there.
Thank you. This is very interesting, and I'm wondering about his religious commitments. It seemed to be quite difficult to picture someone working across the things he's working across with this set of ideas without having some sense about how that fitted with whatever the religious commitments were, and I'm sure there were some because of that period.
So that's actually quite a controversial question, and was in his lifetime. So one of the first academic jobs he got was at a evangelical school, denominational school in Ohio. And he was very nearly fired because on his first day there, he was in the lunch hall. Someone saw him and said, Dr. Du Bois will lead us in prayer. To which Du Bois said, no, he will not. And then he nearly got fired. It seems, I've read a little bit about this, and it seems that he would sometimes appeal to Christian language, and he's wrote this famous thing, the Creed, which has the form of a prayer to God, and he would often invoke Christ as an ideal figure. But his personal religious commitments are a little bit opaque. It seemed that while he was obviously inspired in some ways by Christianity as the religious cultural form he was most familiar with, he never quite wholeheartedly devoted himself to the faith. At least that's my knowledge.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is also, though, that he roots a lot of his conception of what he calls Negro culture could be in spirituality. And so even if he may be an on-again, off-again Christian, he is spiritual in at least two senses. One, he takes very seriously the history of slave music in the South as being a major contribution. At some point, he calls it the only piece of real culture that the South has delivered in America. Right, is the music of the enslaved, and the other sense in which he's spiritual is in thinking about African religion as kind of prophetic. Right, and there is a prophetic quality to a lot of what he's saying and what he's talking about. So another way of reading the concept of double consciousness is actually as a spiritual belief called the veil about the possibility of second sight, right? And so he's always treading a line between, let's say, the secular and the spiritual, particularly in the early writings, that is productive.
Oh, and one more thing, I was reminded by he's got this very famous analysis of the spiritual music of the rural African American poor, which he was very fond of. And in the same book in which this is put forward, he wrote a short story. It's probably my favorite of Du Bois's fiction, about somebody trying and failing to play the role of a kind of elite cultural leader. It's called Of the Coming of John, where a young man from a town in the south goes away to the north to get educated, and while there sort of loses his faith, or at least starts to speak and act in a very secular way, and then comes back and tries to play the role of the Du Boisian talented tenth, the Du Boisian elite, guiding the people of his old town to a better way of life. And the people are horrified by his atheism, and they won't follow him, they won't let him play that role. And the story's a tragedy, but I won't spoil the ending. It doesn't end well. And so that does seem to be some kind of acknowledgement of, like, if you're going to be the leader to the African-American population of the time Du Bois is writing, he seems to think that you have to be at least outwardly a Christian, and maybe deeper than that too. And so there's some kind of relationship between them.
The other interesting thing, I think, is that Washington, as well as, secular agnostic, and often rails against the kind of exploitive role of an element among the black ministry, at least. So I think there's a trend in the late 19th century South toward an opening up of a kind of secular space in African-American culture that you can see in the rise of blues music, for instance, as a tradition, which is, seen as the devil's music by the black church in many ways. And, with increased urbanization, with movement north, we get, I think, a real internal struggle within the African community in the South about Christianity. Du Bois, in some ways, doesn't really push it as hard as Washington does, but it's significant, I think, that both of the major leaders, and we should talk about Ida Wells because she's important here, but left to the side, but both of the main kind of recognized African-American leaders are secular agnostic, or at least, uncommitted to Christianity in a attempting to lead a people who are overwhelmingly committed to the church.
And that's one of the things which always makes the relationship between Du Bois and King so interesting, where Du Bois sort of speaks of the role of this kind of intellectual, cultural leader who will guide the struggles of the African American people, and obviously wants to play that role himself, and approximates to it, but is never quite occupies the position which he wishes to. Whereas King, who is like Du Bois, he's a PhD, he's an intellectual, but is also a Christian minister, is the person who's able to play that role, and so it has some kind of the coming of John-esque feature.
Do you think? So I think that there's something in Du Bois's internationalism in terms of his early life and also his later travels and so on that disconnects him a little bit from America in a way that maybe King is not quite as disconnected. Like King feels rooted in his context in a way that Du Bois, I mean, it's both a beautiful thing and a tragedy. Du Bois is this incredibly unique cosmopolitan figure that travels the world essentially twice over at a time when, most African Americans are being horribly oppressed, and he falls in love in Germany, and he travels to Africa relatively late, and he's from the north but he lives in the south, and he's always slightly out of joint. And there's a funny thing about him being his personal kind of sartorial choices being very à la mode, right? He likes to be a bit of a dandy. He's always very sharply turned out, and he seems to be more of that kind of, if I might characterize it slightly cynically, that sort of elite cosmopolitan figure, and he inhabits that very comfortably and less comfortably as a man of the people.
Mm-hmm. Yes, quite so. I mean, I actually, on his odd sartorial choices, I think I recall reading that he modeled himself when he was studying in Germany. He saw the Kaiser riding by one day and thought, yeah, that's me up there. And so he adopted Prussian cavalry officer gloves, which he would wear for the rest of his life, which is the man was bold.
And the facial hair, of course.
I'm learning a lot here. I know.
We have time for a couple more questions from the audience. There's one from the second row here. Please wait for the microphone to come to you so we can capture the question. Yeah, I didn't.
Hello, thank you so much for interesting comments so far. I had just wanted to ask a question in relation to, his concept of race. One of the things I noticed, particularly when I was reading Dusk of Dawn, is that he also tries to get into the psychology of how it feels to be discriminated against and racialized. He does that in relation to whiteness as well when he's talking about his encounters, explaining how he's racialized specifically in relation to the white men that speak to him. I think it gets particularly dark in Dark Water, where he talks about propaganda in terms of dealing with being dehumanized or when you're cast as black. I was wondering if you could talk about that. I was also hoping for anyone who has knowledge in relation to his relations to other religions, particularly Zionism, Judaism, I meant specifically, because I remember that was one thing that he said when the Negro in the Warsaw Ghetto, so realizing there was a connection between other groups being discriminated against on the basis of race and himself.
I mean, it sounds like you may have read just what I've read, but I can say that on Judaism, after World War II, he felt that there was a lot of parallel between the way Jews had been treated in Central Europe and the position of African Americans in America, and so this is more sort of Jews as an ethnos rather than the Jewish religion, but he clearly saw them as kind of an oppressed group. And I know he actually engaged in some correspondence with Albert Einstein, where Albert Einstein wrote a short piece for a journal that Du Bois was editor of that time, where Einstein outlines the idea that kind of as a German Jew, he kind of had a sort of empathy for the position of African Americans and supported their struggle. And that was Du Bois and Einstein sort of had basically the same idea, and that's why Du Bois commissioned the piece. Maybe Meera, you could on the psychology of race.
So I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think on the psychology of racism, no, of course he took it very seriously, and he was conscious that he was black in America in a way that he wasn't in either Europe or Africa, right? So in both Germany and Africa, he wasn't received in the same way. And he actually, in some senses, felt more liberated to be fully human, right? And so there is a strain in him about the gaze, about the sort of kinds of questions and the kinds of what we might in today's parlance call sort of microaggressions, which was not a term that would have all made sense to him, but those interactions. But I think at the same time he was developing what I would call a sort of historical and sociological analysis of the same. So he always kind of came back to seeing these things as functionally important in what I'd say industrial capitalism. And so he was weaving out stories about Africa's role in history that brought essentially from sort of 5,000 years ago, ancient Egyptians, up to the present. And what he wanted to show, and in a way is sort of riposte to the sort of psychologizing of race, is that the oppression of black people was functionally important to the development of industrial capitalism. So I don't know if that kind of really answers the question, but I think that is really important, that particularly, there's a lot of things going on. The other thing I just wanted to say was a lot of anti-colonial thinkers watching the Second World War and its aftermath pointed out the parallels between anti-Semitism and the Holocaust that happened in Europe with what had been happening previously. Actually, Du Bois had done this in 1915 when comparing the slaughter of Europeans to the slaughter of Congolese, and why one was an object of international outcry and the other wasn't. And you saw it again in the 1930s, where the invasion of Ethiopia, Abyssinia, by Italy was not kind of pushed back against. So he was very conscious of the fundamental hypocrisy that racism produced in modernity. So, right, modernity has these liberalizing, progressive, scientific aspirations, except the hypocrisies produced by race sort of pull those apart and undermine them all the time.
There's one other piece, I think, that we haven't touched on, but it's important for Du Bois's development, and that is from the from around the period of the First World War, Du Bois is deeply engaged with the left, with Marxists in and around New York City, and in 1926 visits the Soviet Union, a trip that makes a deep impression upon him. And the most, for him, the most, I suppose, spectacular aspect of that trip is his impression that the Soviet Union has solved the nationalities problem, and particularly a long history of anti-Semitism that the Soviet government, the early Soviet government, has made deep inroads against a deep-rooted tradition.
That came back.
Politics. What's that?
Anti-Semitism came back, I suppose.
Absolutely, and I think Du Bois underestimates that, by the way. It's an impressionistic impression. I think there are problems with this impression. He's there for a short period and overestimates the degree of change he's seen. But the other thing, which is very important, if you look at his correspondence all through the 1920s and 30s, that many of the people who he's engaged with intellectually in New York are part of the left milieu, many of them disproportionately Jews, many of them having been born in Eastern Europe or in Russia and having moved to New York and been involved in, on the left. Du Bois is engaged with this.
Was he a Marxist, would you say?
Well, he claimed to be by the end of his life, and he's certainly deeply engaged with Marxism. I think for most of the 30s, Du Bois is reading extensively in Marxism, and also Black Reconstruction really is a work of Marxist historiography, which I think is part of what gives it its explanatory power. But certainly all through his life, Du Bois is, I shouldn't say all through his life, from the First World War onward, I think Du Bois is engaged with Marxism. We can talk about this, but I think the kind of talented tent, that elitist strain in his thinking, leads him to a certain version of Marxism, which, and eventually to fairly unapologetic support for Stalinism in Russia.
So, I mean, I'd say Du Bois actually had a habit of visiting authoritarian regimes being given a very helpful tour guide by the leaders of, say, the authoritarian regime, and coming back and reporting like, wow, that place is great. He was a very astute sociologist, but he seemed to fall for this one every time. So,
and this is even when pretty awful things have been exposed, he's still writing in relatively glowing terms about the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, he maintains, for as far as I know, till the end of his life, that Trotsky was an agent paid off by Hitler, which was just kind of a ridiculous conspiracy theory. But
He defends the Soviet Union after Khrushchev's revelations. So I think in some ways he's moving more towards that position in the latter years of his life. He's got a much more fluid and I think creative engagement with Marxism in the 30s.
Was he also a Democrat?
Yes, oddly. So his commitment to democracy was real and shouldn't be understated. He was a campaigner for women's suffrage. He campaigned to sort of end the various restrictions on voting for African Americans in the South. He would argue against imperialist projects, and sort of one of the fundamental premises was that they were anti-democratic. And so, yes, he was certainly also committed to democracy. Now, I think partly how that's reconciled with his support, for instance, for Stalin is just some false beliefs about what's going on in the Soviet Union. He thinks that actually what's happened is they said they were giving all power to the Soviets, right? So that means it must be that there's workers' councils running things now. No, it's not so simple as that, but there is just this element of he maintains some convenient false beliefs about what's going on in these regimes.
And just on that, I think what's interesting is that it's precisely his attempt to solve the race problem that drives him in both of those directions. So if we take a step back, the race problem in America is an attempt to keep the proletariat, the white proletariat, on the side of the capitalists in some respects, right? And so imperialism and racism help to unite a social body that is fundamentally fragmenting as a result of the degradations of capitalism, right? So the analysis that he gives of how and why racism functions is very much rooted in Marxism, but he's also a real American, right? In some sense, he really believes in the promise of what we might call the American dream, but to realize it means to confront both racism and capitalism in a particular kind of way.
So maybe instructive is the Black Reconstruction is a work of Marxist history. And one of the things he does there is he analogizes the role of the kind of northern military in maintaining the Freedmen's Bureau to something. He doesn't think it's a dictatorship of the proletariat, but he thinks it's something like that will go, where there is a strong government hand basically suppressing the various revanchist movements. But that's allowing for democracy. There is actually a condition for the possibility of black people to take place in a democracy in the South. And the evidence for that is the minute that went away, there was a terrorist campaign against the black population. And so I think what he thought, I take from this, the hope was something like apparently strong authoritarian governments could just be used to sort of crush anti-democratic movements and allow a democracy to foster. How plausible that would be in actual cases, I don't know, and there were very special circumstances which made that possible in the South. But
Yes, okay, let's take one more question from the back here. It'd be great if we could find a working microphone. That would be fantastic to allow us to hear your question. Just wait a moment, I think we've got one.
Did Du Bois find notoriety in America more or in Germany? I mean, with his work, his writings, and with his entire being, basically, from where he had transgressed from, moved forward to, and with his teachings and his practice.
But he ends his life in Ghana rather than America, basically exiled from America. McCarthyism hit him hard. He was seen as a kind of dangerous, radical Marxist black person, and so he was really targeted by the American state. And so by the end of his life, in sort of official American, the official position of American government is that Du Bois is a pariah, and so he really did gain a lot of notoriety in America. As to his position in Germany, well, I know the East German government were under instructions to like him from Khrushchev, but does anyone know anything more about the German situation?
No, but I think in some ways, just to come back to Du Bois and the latter stage of his life when he's very often outspoken in defense of what's going on in Russia, I think that's the other piece of it. I mean, part of it is I think Du Bois has a long attachment to this cult of the expert where kind of an elite would deliver emancipation for humanity. And there's an element of that in Stalinism. But the other piece is that Du Bois is being pushed into a corner by the U.S. Government. I mean, he suffers terribly under McCarthyism. He's not the only one. Paul Robeson, who he's very close friends with, also, was brought to, people who know Robeson, tremendously powerful, strong intellect, brought to nervous breakdown, basically, by the repression that's meted out by the U.S. government. So there's an element of the enemy of my enemy is my friend in Du Bois' attachment to the Soviet Union, I think, as well. But it doesn't, in my view at least, it doesn't excuse it.
No, and I suppose it's also important to, again, think about that political context. So he's increasingly, I think, in some senses, activist towards the end of his life. And the repression by the American state is also related to his political connections to either newly independent or liberation movements. So they actually take his passport, so he can't go to the Bandung conference where Nehru and Nkrumah and Suharto are meeting. And he's very much part of that milieu. So he has to negotiate the political demands of the polarity as well as, let's say, the intellectual demands.
I think there's another question from yes, the end of the row there.
I think that would be the last question. I will ask a question about democracy. And one speaker said democracy is the power of wisdom. But with the life with the Du Bois, I think he saw a poor black man's bones in a shop. Actually, 2,000 white men burned the poor black man. And so actually, how to people to understand this bad case about democracy? If 2,000 white people made the decision, you have seen and we should burn you. And I didn't find any result about the ending of these 2,000 white people. What happened to them? How do people deal with that? Thank you.
Yeah, it was a real problem for him. So earlier in his life, he'd joined the Socialist Party, having been inspired by Eugene Debs, a very famous socialist leader, but actually left within a year because he became convinced that if we gave too much power to the union movement, which was then controlled by a certain elite section of the white working class, that these people hate black people, and it would be terrible for us if they were to be the ones who inherit power under socialism. And so he did have these real concerns about what it would result in if we sort of actually devolved power to the masses of people in America, given the racist propaganda. I'll be interested to hear what other people say, but I think part of my sense of how Du Bois got out of this is he thought that what you're seeing in America, the current degree of racial animus, the violence, the oppression, like that's partly the result of the fact that we're not a democracy. It's the result of the fact that the press is owned by a small number of capitalists, the great educational institutions is controlled by the US state, which he thought was not really a democracy. And all of these things have an interest in sort of keeping us apart. They have an interest in turning one section of the working class on another section. And so they foster division and hatred. In a real democracy, these things wouldn't have that kind of incentive structure. And so he thought that democracy would actually help lessen racial tensions. And so sort of the best way to solve the difficulties we would have if we were to move to a democracy would be more democracy. And so I think he thought it was a problem which we would actually work our way out of if only we had democratic control of the institutions of state and government.
I mean, we'll take more questions soon, but Liam, I want to move on to this topic of Du Bois' views on science, and perhaps social science in particular. I mean, how did Du Bois see the role of science, social science, in relation to race and racism? Did he see science as an inherently racist endeavour?
So this is, as with everything, it's something which changed over the course of his life. So early in his life, I think as was mentioned before, Du Bois largely took the view that a lot of what underlay racist behaviour and racist beliefs were just factual mistakes about how the world is. And largely that was because science was being done badly on its own terms. It's not that science is an inherently racist endeavour, it's that people were simply failing to do science. So he has this phrase he would often use. He would describe people as car window sociologists because he thought that their research consisted of driving through town once, looking out their car window and saying, oh, the slums look dirty, I guess they're bad then. And, that's it. And he said, you can't call that scientific research just because it's getting published. It's not, in some sense, it doesn't really reflect accurate scientific work. And so his early position is just we should do more science and better science, and it would correct the racist lies and propaganda.
This was a time when social science was not really a well-established thing. He was arguing for it.
So there's recently been a book come out called by Alton Morris, whose name I just forgot and I tried to cover for it, is The Scholar Denied, which argues that Du Bois should really be credited with founding the first sociological school in America. The Atlanta Sociological Laboratory is probably the first department of sociology which can really be said to exist. He had gone to, it's telling that he had to go to Berlin to get his degree, partly because it was the best university in the world at the time, but also partly because it was one of the only places you could really learn sort of statistical method as applied to society at the time. His book, The Philadelphia Negro, is often thought to be the first work of quantitative urban ethnography in American history. So he's really a pioneer in social science in America. And so, it's I think part of what you can see him as saying is what has passed for social science before, what has passed for systematic observation of social life, fails to meet even sort of minimal scientific standards.
So this is the early view. The early view is, quantitative, rigorous social science is crucial. It's something that actually promotes the fight against racism.
Yeah. And his later view is, I describe it as a nuancing of this. He never abandons the view that in the end people believe a lot of false things, and if only they would study the world more rigorously, that would overcome that. But he develops more of a sense that it's not just that they sort of contingently happen to believe false things, but that in some sense they're sort of various psychological and social forces make those beliefs hard to dislodge. That it won't do just to present them with stuff which is quite decisive counter-argument. You need to make that information vivid to them in such a way that it will get through those psychological barriers and change the aspects of society which give people an incentive to uphold those lies. And so it's not so much that he abandons his view of science, but he comes to nuance it a bit more with an appreciation of the psycho and social forces upholding propaganda.
So a need for propaganda, not just science, in a way.
A need to sort of supplement one's scientific research with counter-propaganda, or present one's scientific research in a way which is more vivid. So The Souls of Black Folk, it doesn't read like a work of sociology, but very frequently, if you know his prior research, you can see in the chapters underlying it is like observational or quantitative social science. It's just he's now trying to present that work in a sort of poetic way or through fiction, in a way which he thinks might actually break through people's racist imaginations.
Let's talk about propaganda, because, this is a word with negative associations, right? Sounds like a bad thing, but to some extent Du Bois is a kind of qualified defender of propaganda for the right purposes. Meera?
I would, not so much propaganda, but a narrative, right? A narrative history, and this is, and this speaks to his scholarship in the fields of history, and particularly African history. And Brian will maybe be able to say a bit more about Black Reconstruction, but he's consciously aware that one of the myths surrounding black people is the absence of a historical presence for them. So he spends a lot of time researching African history, the civilizations of Ethiopia and and southern Africa, the varied different kinds of peoples and languages that have existed all over the continent. Why? Because he is experimenting in some sense with the reconstruction of a black historical subject that can then be an equal contributor to human civilization as a whole.
So I guess he sees a lot of the history of his day written by white people itself a kind of propaganda. It kind of erases black people.
Yes, I mean, if you think very concretely about the ways in which the American continent has been settled, in which the continents around the world are subject to imperialist control and expansion, and you look at things like the Conference of Berlin, which is the division of Africa but set up as a sort of anti-slave trade conference, then that propaganda is just sort of everywhere, and he can see through it. But he realizes that it's not enough just to say, you know, you guys are wrong, but that blackness is something real and these are people with civilizational pride.
So
I think in terms of historiography, because there are parallels really, and maybe it grows out of his changing approach to science and scientific research, but in Black Reconstruction, he argues not really that black people have been erased from history, but there's been a kind of a systematic denigration of what he calls Reconstruction the greatest attempt to establish democracy for the working millions that the world had ever yet seen. For Du Bois, Reconstruction is really the high point, you know, in American history in terms of democracy for the masses. The attempt that he detects among white historians to diminish the importance of that experience is not really about erasure as it is as much about denigrating and burying that history. So he talks about and I'm paraphrasing, but he says something about a deliberate effort to so change the facts of history that it will make pleasant reading for white Americans. That's what he talks about in a chapter called The Propaganda of History, which is a systematic demolition job on a generation of racist historiography. I mean, Du Bois really takes on the whole of the historical profession and demolishes them in a single chapter.
So actually that chapter, The Propaganda of History, it's one of the ones that I've looked at the most in thinking about Du Bois's changing views on science, because this is from the 30s, which is relatively late in his scientific career. And one of the interesting things about that is you can find him saying some of the same things he was saying in the 1890s about science, which is he thinks that indeed white historians have systematically gone wrong. They've denigrated African Americans. And he places the blame he places the blame on the particular social goals they're trying to advance, but his argument's more general than that. His argument is that it's problematic for a scientist to be trying to advance social goals. This is one of the ways in which I said that Du Bois actually answers quite general questions about the kind of thing science is along the way to answering the particular things. And that's an argument which has been constant with him since the 1890s. He's fundamentally suspicious of the scientist, qua scientist, in their scientific work, trying to promote a particular social ideal, because he thinks that will always lead to misrepresentation. In this case, in service of what's more a pernicious ideology. But
right. So you might think he's someone who thinks science needs to have anti-racist values, but really he thinks science should be value-free.
But of course he then thinks that if you did that, it would have the consequence of being anti-racist.
Yeah, because he thinks science as it is actually sort of infused with racist values.
Shot through racist assumptions. Now, there is a little bit of a tension here, which is that Du Bois himself was simultaneously a scientist and somebody who was obviously actively working to promote social goals throughout his life. And I think this is one of the points where Du Bois's elitism comes in. Du Bois is very clever, and he can simultaneously be an activist and a scientist, but he thinks that most scientists can't be trusted with that. It will interfere with their reasoning.
The average scientist should try and not address questions of value at all, just leave politics out of it.
And I think that's informative as to, it tells you something about this guiding elite, right? It turns out it's not enough to have a PhD from Harvard, right? Like, it's only a very special kind of person who gets to be one of the real guiding elite.
Great. I mean, let's take a few more questions from the audience now. There's a question here. Again, please wait for the microphone to come to you.
Hi. The United Nations Constitution identifies racism as a part of discrimination. So how did it happen, how they included it, and what is the role of Du Bois in that?
No, I was going to say, I don't think the Convention on Racial Discrimination happens until the mid-50s, 54 or 55. Actually, Du Bois had been in San Francisco in 1945. A delegation from the NAACP had been there in 1945 asking for racism to be written into the UN Charter and being rebuffed, essentially, by the imperialist powers at the time. So it's only when, let's say, the Third World gets going in the UN that they're able to pass such things as the Convention on Racial Discrimination. And then after that, what you get is a lot of substitutions of race talk for culture talk and civilization talk. And so it progresses a bit from there.
Was Du Bois an influence on the UN at all?
He's deeply involved in the Pan-Africanist movement, and as has been said, is, I suppose, the most important development for him in the post-war world, even though the Cold War is descending, is the emergence of new independent nations in Africa and Asia, which he is deeply attached to, and also, I think, it played a role in kind of promoting over decades before that.
Let's go to the second row here. Sorry for the delay while the microphone makes its way over. It's great if we can capture the question.
Thank you for your time so far. I just wanted to ask, what was his relationship like with Marcus Garvey, if any?
Marcus Garvey, quite hostile. I think in line with sort of many intellectuals of the day, he largely thought Garvey was a huckster. I mean, he just thought he was a kind of a fraud. Later, he did also acknowledge that Garvey's organizational abilities were quite something. It was one of it was to that point the largest movement of African Americans, which for their own civil rights, which had then existed, and he had to acknowledge that mattered and that was important to his goals. But Garvey's political movement of sort of recolonizing Africa, but with the movement of African Americans, the scheme where you gave him money and he would make you a duke in the coming kingdom, he largely saw this as fraud, and perhaps with reason. So,
I think he couldn't have helped to notice Garvey's deep influence in Harlem, though, for example, and some of the people who Du Bois had collaborated with before the First World War. Hubert Harrison's an important figure and probably important to Garvey's rise in Harlem. Du Bois has relationships with these people that are severed after he takes a position supporting the U.S. during the First World War. For Harrison and for others, Du Bois alienates himself, I think, from the most radical elements in the black community in Harlem. So he has a complicated relationship with Garvey. I see a bit of envy in that as well, because in some ways Du Bois is engaged in some very similar agitation. But he has a critique of Garvey at the same time. I think for the wartime period, up until the mid-20s, really, Du Bois is outside the ranks of the most active and energetic elements in New York and in black New York.
It should be said that his support for World War I, he came to sort of bitterly rue that. So he had encouraged African Americans to sign up. He wrote a famous article, Close Ranks, that we can sort of demonstrate our loyalty and worth as citizens by serving on the front. Now, in many other ways, Du Bois was a pacifist, and he himself had analysed this as a fundamentally imperialist war, and so people saw it as a real betrayal for him then to line up behind the drums for war. And he himself came to regret the decision. He thought, especially since the soldiers were it totally failed to gain any respect. They were harassed and lynched and murdered upon return. And he just thought, like, I encourage people to engage in this traumatic, bad thing, and it didn't have any positive respects or goals. So it severed his relationship with a lot of radicals, and then he himself admitted it was a big mistake.
What did he think about World War II?
I don't know about that. I mean, he certainly thought it was good that the Nazis were defeated. He had at one point in his life, he had been a booster for Imperial Japan, because he saw it as a non-white power finally defeating the Western powers and driving back imperialism. But by the time of World War II, he also sees Imperial Japan as like not a good state, not the kind of thing that should be supported. Mm-hmm. So I don't know of any writings of his specifically addressing kind of entering the war, but he clearly thinks the defeat of fascism was a very good thing.
Further questions? Yeah, there's quite a few here. So let's go to the second row, and then we'll go back.
I had a question about something earlier. I had to leave, so I thought I would ask it quickly. Apologies for my about-to-be absence. I had a question about the problem of the color line. There seems to have been debate in political studies about how significant his problem of the color line was. He upset, I remember, quite a few, not just Garvey, but there's another famous one, I Am Not Your Negro, focus of the documentary, who also was quite upset with Du Bois as well for how he felt that religion could be, race could be this universally applied thing where you could be a part of a race if you're part of a religion, and that anyone could be a part of the oppressed races. Could you talk about whether the role of the problem of the color line is important in relation to international politics or philosophy as well?
Yeah, so again, as with the concept of double consciousness, you can see the engagement of the global colour line as a point of cherry-picking within Du Bois's thought. Again, it's something that he only explicitly mentions a couple of times. However, I do think it's consistent with his wider analytics of imperialism, that I think if you're framing it in today's lingo, you might see it as a tension between, let's say, Afro-pessimism and political blackness. So Du Bois, I think, would fall in the latter category in the sense that although he's a real believer in black uplift, he sees exploitation in amongst the darker races of the world as being ultimately kind of a similar type and effect. So even though it has a specific instantiation in the States, the colour line is his way of saying, actually, this is happening around the world.
Let's take a couple more questions in quick succession. So let's go to the third row there, and then we'll go to the back of the room. If we just do one question after another, then we'll have time to get more in.
Did Du Bois think that the white working class was a completely lost cause? Did he have any sort of strategies to unite the black and white working class in the southern United States? And just in terms of his thought and ideas, if there was one particular thought that sort of crystallized into having some relevance for the contemporary situation in America with Trump in the White House, what would that be?
Good. And let's go straight to the question from the back of the room then, and then we'll come back to the panel on both.
Could you expand on if there were any changes? We seem to be getting a reflection of the man's mind, say, having lived in Europe and having lived in America. Could you expand on, did he have a varied worldview, having been forced to, say, live in Ghana? What was his worldview if he had a change in his latter life, living in Ghana?
Great. So a question about white working class in Du Bois' time and the time of Trump, and a question about how Du Bois' experiences in living in Africa and Europe shaped his views.
So I guess let me come to the last question first. So it was only quite late in his life that he moved to Ghana. So I think it's been said that the Du Bois' funeral was actually the first major state event in Ghana after independence. I don't think you see any sort of major change in his worldview, but he certainly becomes even more enthusiastic about Nkrumah and the liberation movements then going on in the Third World. So it encourages him in some of his beliefs. He thinks like this is the right track and we should keep going with this revolutionary movement for independence around the world. I mean, I'll let other people come in with questions.
Oh, just to maybe add to that, I think his encounter with actual continental Africans as opposed to the imagined kind of African diaspora complicates his views on the possibilities of race solidarity, and I think he sees those things as more difficult in practice than he had imagined either from his kind of writing room in Germany or in the States. So I think that's a slight complication. I want to think about the Trump question a bit.
Okay. On the white working class, I mean, I think this is important, and it figures somewhat in Black Reconstruction, because one of the questions that he confronts is why, if it's the case that former slaves are fighting for during Reconstruction, are fighting for a more egalitarian society where the old planter class no longer rules the roost, why is it that white workers, white labor in the South, most often takes the side of their former rulers? And Du Bois explains this with something that I think he got from correspondence with somebody else on the left, but he says that white workers are compensated for their destitution, their poor material conditions, by a psychological wage. That is, a sense of racial superiority offers some compensation, meager compensation you might say, for their deprivation. And I think there's a tension in Du Bois, which I think is worth, which has kind of enduring power between, on the one hand, he argues there are no people anywhere on the face of the earth with more in common than black and white workers in the South. On the other hand, most of American history is a story about the white working classes being engaged in vicious racial or brought along on vicious racial kind of pogroms. So I think he would like to see, he aspires to see a multiracial, interracial labor movement, but is, I think, fairly sober about the prospects for that in the late 19th century South, and rightly so, I think. The other thing that should be said, really, is that Du Bois does not really have a relationship with the labor movement at any point in his life. I mean, there is an organized labor movement, and in the 1930s, there's quite a dynamic explosion of labor struggles among black workers that Du Bois really doesn't have a relationship to. There are other people in his milieu, Abram Harris, Ralph Bunchy, A. Philip Randolph, people who he'd been his contemporaries, who are deeply involved in this. Du Bois is out of touch, I think, with that, and therefore remains pessimistic even when those possibilities present themselves in the 1930s in ways that his contemporaries are more insulated from.
So to sort of crystallize a thought from Du Bois which might be relevant to contemporary America, and I say contemporary America because this predates Trump. I think from the outside one can underestimate how much the struggle for basic voting rights continues in America. There's a real sense in which many African Americans in particular, it's very racialized, still are unable to get political representation through the ballot books. And if you take Du Bois's early argument seriously, if you take this point that you can't achieve various economic and social goals until you can protect yourself politically from the machinations of the state, both local and distant, and also ensure that the various supposedly neutral elements of the state actually work to your benefit when they're meant to, then it gives real reason to focus on the continued struggle for actually gaining rights to vote, like effective right to political representation for African Americans. So I think the lesson I take from Du Bois is that's a worthy object of focus. That's where to concentrate our energies.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but I mean that comment about the contemporary relevance of Du Bois, I think, is a fantastic closing remark. So let's thank all of our panelists for a really interesting discussion.